Hi there. In this video, we will wrap up the course. If you remember from the previous chapters that we started this course by talking about the red flags that might alert the fraud examiner or the forensic accountant about the incidence of fraud. And we said that red flags are not the only thing, but it's just the beginning for the examiner to start collecting more evidence. And we mentioned different types of evidence, starting by oral evidence, collecting information from people by interviewing or collecting documents. And we say we have to make a chain of custody for the documents. And we try to analyze the evidence and keep track of the evidence. In the meantime, we start to make interviewing for the different people, starting by the third-party witness, going to the cooperative witness, going to the co-conspirators, and then the suspect. And we said that during our discussion with the subject, we should investigate the crime scene and see the exact incident of fraud, either it's physical fraud or cyber fraud. And then we start talking about the different kind of frauds that might happen in the cyberspace and how can we minimize, defend against those kind of frauds. Then we start talking about the ethics and the rules that control the fraud examiner during his investigation. And we say ethics will happen or become an issue if the fraud examiner is thinking about different solutions, and all of them, they might have negative impact, and he has to serve the community at the end of the day and make the right thing. So we say, if the fraud examiner follows the rules and regulations, this is the minimum threshold. But we expect the fraud examiner to have high value, high commitment to the society, to the employees, and make sure that the approach is taken is in compliance with all the rules and regulations. And now we come to the last point, which is what are the other services the fraud examiner or the forensic accountant can provide to his clients in addition to the exact process of fraud examination in case of fraud. So in this chapter, we will talk about different services that can be offered by the fraud examiners or the forensic accountant. And one of them, we call it remediation. And from the name, you can tell the remediation will try to find a peaceful solution between the defendant and the plaintiff without going to the court. So we try to come up on the table, open up the discussion, see where we can meet and how we can compensate for the losses. If the remediation doesn't work well, then we go to litigation. And here we have to present our case to the court and then go through the legal procedures. In the meantime, the forensic accountant can provide advisory or consulting service to his clients. When we come to the remediation, we need to be aware the forensic accountant can work as an expert witness due to his experience in the field and due to the number of cases that he made. Also, in the forensic accountant can offer a fact-based testimony to the judge if it happens. He has to be prepared, be objective, be truthful, and those are the key characteristics that the forensic accountant should have before going into the legal kinds of solutions. And try to avoid technical jargon, because in forensic accountant, and this is what I was trying to do during the course, not to overload you with the different terminologies that we use it in forensic accountant, that might need time and effort from the normal person to understand what they need. So the forensic accountant in his presentation before the other party or before the judge or the attorney has to be clear, has to be organized, objective, and maintain the body language that gives clear message to the other party and maintain his composure. So in the remediation, first of all, we need to clean up the mess. What does it mean? We need to recover the money that was lost, the assets were lost, so that the victim and the defendant will go into their original situation before the commitment of the fraud. So when I say clean up the mess, clean up the outcomes that came out from the fraud investigation or the fraudulent case. The second thing is to support the client through the litigation, and here whether by testifying or attending the hearing or the deposition. And the forensic accountant should go to the crime scene, just the place where the fraud has been made, if this is feasible, and try to understand again how the fraud was made so that he can provide different advice or solution to prevent or deter the fraud from being happened again. So here, the forensic accountant will go one more time to the crime scene to see what had happened and what can he tell his client about to prevent this event from happening again. How about if the fraud was related to financial statements? In this case, we need to see where the deficiency in the corporate governance. What does it mean? Was there any deficiency in the audit committee, or the internal audit, or the internal control environment? We need to know where was the deficiency in the corporate governance structure and how the executive management was involved in this issue. Because when the fraud comes into the financial statement issue, usually the executive management has a big share in this fraud. And how the fraud was hidden from the audit committee or the board of directors and the external audit. So the forensic accountant should examine all these issues. And now once we finalize the issue about the fraud, then we need to think about how can we recover the money. And we need to weigh the cost-benefit factor in this issue. Because if the fraud examiner concluded that there is a fraud, and this is the defendant or the person who committed the fraud, and this person took a lot of money, but if the fraud examiner took the defendant to the court, he will not be able to recover all the money. So here we have to think, should we spend all the time and the cost for the sake of getting a portion of the money that was lost? This one we call it cost benefit. So the cost is related to the forensic accountant fees times the benefit is the recovery of the lost money. So we have to keep this in mind. And then there are other issues we need to consider here is how much we can win the case if we take it to the court. So even if the fraud examiner is sure about his conclusion, how can he present it to the court, and how much confident he will be in winning the court side into his side? So we have to think about this one. We have to think about the approximate amount that has been stolen and how much of this stolen amount can be recovered. In the same way, we think about the assets. So maybe the person had stolen some cash and valuable items like diamond or jewelry, but we cannot get this asset because maybe he has sold them to another person and so on. So we need to know about the possibility of recovering the cash, recovering the valuable assets, and covering up the legal cost for the forensic fees. So we have to think about all these issues as we proceed with the recovery of money. And the next point is, once we make our estimation about the recovery of money, then we need to verify or present an evidence to the court about the three elements of fraud. Number one, that the defendant or the fraudster committed the act. So we have to prove this one. Second, we have to prove that this person was trying to hide the asset or the cash and then convert it for his benefit. And we have to have access to all the records, either from banks or public institutions or any other organization, to prove that the fraudster or the defendant stole the amount of assets, conceal them, convert them for his benefit. We have to provide an evidence so that we can recover this asset from the person. In addition to that, we have to cover up for the following losses that you can see on the screen. Number one, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we need to recover the cash and the stolen assets. But also we need to recover any salary that has been lost or expenses that has been lost due to this fraud. So for example, if the fraud happened and some of the employees couldn't work and those people, they are paid by hour, so any loss in the salary of those innocent employees has to be recovered from the dividend as well. Then any other expenses, either repair or security or any other maintenance that we made it to the operation due to this fraud. This one, we call it economic losses. So we have to recover the compensatory losses. We have to recover the economic losses which are attached. And we have to recover the reliance cost. What do we mean by reliance? We have to return the victim back into his original economic situation before the fraud. For example, if a company had a fraudulent case, and this case went out to the news and it affects the company's reputation, then we need to calculate the amount of losses that the company has made due to this fraud. And we need to return the company back to its original place before the fraudulent happened. Whatever cost we recover it here, we call it reliance cost. And finally, we need to charge the defendant punitive damage. It means penalizing him for his action so that he cannot do it again. And we put an example for other people so they don't put it again. We call it punitive damages. In the civil framework, we have to also demonstrate an evidence for the cause for the damage to happen. And the defendant was able to estimate his action and the consequences of his action and reasonably assure about the amount to be claimed. So we have to verify those three elements, that the person, he was the main reason for this act to happen. The person was able to predict the consequences of his act. And finally, the amounts that we need to collect from. Once we made this analysis of our case, collect the evidence, present it to the court, and as I said, we try to ask for different compensations, either compensatory or economic or reliance or punitive. We put this in a report, and now we need to make two things. First, we follow the money that was stolen, and then we trace this money. Following the money, it means we track the funds from the victim to the defendant. How the money was moved from the victim's custody, whether in hand or in person or in the bank account, and to the defendant custody. Then we need to see approximately the amount that has been lost. And then original identifiable form, how the money belongs to the victim in the beginning. And there is no exchange or substitution that happened during the way of the movement of the money. So following the money, we talk about the movement from the victim to the defendant. Tracing the money, any illegal money combined with the legitimate sources. So we need to trace the money, and then what happened to the money or the property, whether it was stolen or concealed or converted into another resource, and who handled it and where it is now. So tracing the money, following the money, it's during the action of the fraud, tracing the money after the fraud. Now, we need to go through this list of legal methods to recover the asset. Now, as I said in my previous slides, how can we present it to the court? How much we can estimate the losses? Now I need to recover the loss. What are the different avenues or methods that I can use it to recover these lost assets? Number one, we can issue freezing orders. Number two, we can claim it from insurance policy. Number three, we can get it from the judges. Number four, we get an order from the court to confiscate the assets and make compensation and forfeiture and seizures of assets. Number five, we make third-party debt orders where the debtors will pay the victims instead of paying the defendant and then recover against third party. So in the coming slides, I will explain each one of those methods because all of them are legitimate methods of collecting our assets back. For the freezing order, here we freeze the assets of the defendant. So number one, we have to be reasonably assured about the case. I cannot go to the defendant assets and freeze all his belongings. Meanwhile, the judge rejected my case. So first of all, I have to provide a good evidence to the court so that I can get the freezing order from the court to freeze the defendant assets so he cannot take them to another country or convert them into the other assets and then they disappear. So freezing order, it's the order that we get from the court to freeze the assets of the defendant so he cannot have control over them. Number two, we have to prove that the victim had suffered significant loss due to this fraudulent case. And the loss that happened to the victim are much higher than the losses that happened to the defendant. So here I say damage done to defendant is less than the damage that happened to the victim. And finally, the risk that assets will disappear, we have to show some urgency to the court so that we can get this freezing order before the assets disappear or concealed or converted. Here we have to keep three different factors in mind. Number one, we need to get this freezing asset as soon as possible. Because if we don't get it as soon as possible, the defendant might have some links where he can send the money, transfer it, conceal it, convert it, and then we will not be able to recover our loss. Number two, we try to make the period of the freezing order as long as possible until we get the final decision by the court and claim our asset from those orders. Number three, we try to enlarge the scope of the freezing order to cover all the assets of the defendant. The next point is the insurance. So freezing order, it's direct contact by the victim's attorney to the court on the assets of the defendant. Insurance, here the victim will go to the insurance company or through the court will go to the insurance company to claim from the insurance any losses. And this would be usually by sworn proof. And it covers all the losses caused by the defendant, whether this defendant is employee or vendor or customer. And some insurance policy will pay back the victim and pay back the fees for the forensic accountant. And once the insurance company, they pay the victim and the forensic accountant, then they will take the right to claim their money from the defendant. This is what they usually do. The next one is the proof. And the court here, where the victim goes directly to the court asking for his money back. Number one, the victim has to be sure that this is the final decision, that if it's made by the judge, it cannot be changed unless there is an appeal. So the victim has to be aware that there is no way back once we go through the judgments. Number two, the amount estimated in the appeal should be very clear and approximate. Number three, whatever the outcome happens from the judge will show up in the credit report of the defendant. So if there is any claim or any accusation happened to the defendant, it will be written in his criminal record. And then the victim will be secure in more secure position to demand the money because it's made by the court, so he can claim it back. And it leaves, as I said, no further action available except for the appeal if it happens. So as you can see here, the victim can claim his money. It's either by the insurance or by claiming the money directly from the defendant or through the judge, or as I said, through the freezing order or through the confiscation order. So what is the difference between confiscation order and freezing order, which I mentioned? The freezing order, he has no control, the defendant has no control on the assets for a certain period of time. The confiscation, we take control of the assets and the defendant cannot take any control except by the court decision. So the confiscation here, most probably the defendant doesn't get access to his assets again. Defendant doesn't pay amounts owed to the victims or plaintiff. Forfeiture orders apply to specific assets. Confiscation and compensation order refer to the amount covered by available assets. So the victim, through the confiscation order, will take the assets, put them on an auction, as you can see here on the courthouse auction, sell them, get his cash back, and the defendant will not have access to those assets again. How about the third-party debt order? This is another way of collecting the amount that has been lost by asking the debtors of the defendant to pay the victim instead of paying the defendant. So for example, if the defendant has a company and he has customers, the victim, through the court decision, will ask the customer to pay their due amounts directly to him to cover up the loss instead of paying the defendant. And this satisfies third party's obligation and the defendant's obligation to the claimant at the same time. So third party, we talk about the customers or the suppliers or the bankers or any third party related to the defendant will pay the victim. Recovery against third party defendants, the accountants, lawyer, executive manager, director, and so on, they may be held responsible for any actions of their company, which is normal. The threshold for such legal action is negligence or gross negligence. Negligence or gross negligence, it means not making due diligence in presenting the right information to the public. So if they do that, they will be held responsible. And the victim will have direct claim against those who benefited from the fraud or the financial crime. So in this short video, I was trying to explain what are the services the forensic accountant can provide to his client, and how can the forensic accountant help his client to recover their losses, no matter whether it's compensatory loss or reliance loss or economic loss or punitive loss, punitive damage. And there are different ways that the client or the victim can claim his money. I will continue talking about the other services in the second video. Thank you. Bye-bye.